Hello, everyone. Before we get into today's episode, we'd like to remind everyone of our ongoing video series over on our YouTube channel, where we follow Britain's 1931 financial crisis week by week and day by day, 90 years on. The 10th episode just came out earlier today, so if you'd like, you can check out the link to our YouTube channel down in the description to watch it. As well as that, as always, we'd like to thank our patrons, including our executive producers, Jeremy Marcoux, Justus Ebel, Tony Turrin, and Tom McCool for helping to support the show. Thanks so much, and now, on with the episode. Imagine yourself walking into an ancient temple. What do you picture? Perhaps a huge, cavernous, open space with massive columns and grand statues in the shape of old gods and goddesses. There's certainly plenty of those found in the ancient world. But today's subject is something a little different from that. An enigmatic religion where you don't worship in a grand, wide open area, but oftentimes a small cave, shrouded in darkness, with a close-knit group of only 30 or so people, all people you would know personally, thanks to the initiation ritual you all went through to get in. This is the fascinating story of Mithraism, history's most mysterious religion. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another very special episode of History's Most. My name is Peter.
And I'm Alex. And today it's my pleasure to say we're joined by Matthew McCarty, who is Assistant Professor of Roman Archaeology at the University of British Columbia. And I'm quite excited to talk to Matthew today because we are going to dive deep into a real kind of mystery of the ancient world, because we're going to look at Mithras worship or Mithraism, a secretive religion of Roman, ancient Rome. So first of all, thanks so much for joining us, Matthew.
Thanks, Alex and Peter, for having me.
Let's set up, if you like, the context for Mithras worship. First of all, I want to ask you first, Matthew, about religion in the Roman Empire overall. What can we actually say about religion and religious practice and religious worship in the Roman Empire?
So, the first thing we have to keep in mind is that the Roman Empire is an enormous and multicultural world that stretches from northern Britain all the way to the Syrian desert, and from the Sahara north to modern Belgium, Germany, places like that. And there are all kinds of groups and peoples living under the empire with their own gods, their own practices, their own beliefs. And as a result of the interconnections brought about by drawing all these different peoples into the Roman Empire, we really have a period of creation and innovation that saw everything from the birth of Christianity to the creation of what we recognize as Judaism, to all of these new forms of religious experience like Mithras worship. Now, the other thing that I want to say is that when I say religion, or when we say religion in the ancient world, think away most of what we would come to think of as religion now. Think away things like belief or ideas about particular gods or orthodoxy, right? The thing that most religions in modernity have been so focused on. When we think about dealing with the gods, dealing with supernatural powers in the Roman world, think mostly of a transactional system, of not, thinking a certain thing about the gods, but dealing with them so that they'll do good things for you and help you out with all manner of problems and hopes that you might have in your life.
And one question that fascinates me is kind of, these are Again, you said not to use religion, but I'm going to use the word for the sake of ease here. But these are religions that are, for the most part, long kind of dead. We can't talk to worshippers. How do we know what we know now about religion in the Roman world? What evidence do we have for it?
So we have all kinds of evidence of different forms. There are, first and foremost, textual accounts. Now, again, unlike Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, we don't have like a sacred text. We don't have a Bible for most forms of what we might see as religion in the ancient world. So we don't have that like core element that keeps everyone on the same page. What we have are sort of individual accounts of what people do, how they worship, philosophical disputes over the nature of gods that, occupy some intellectual slot for very elite people that most people probably aren't too concerned with. And so we have those kinds of writings. We also have the um, the remains, the material remains of the practices that people would engage with. Now, these are sometimes written down, things like inscriptions. And in the Roman Empire, we have thousands of votive inscriptions where someone will make a promise to a god. Jupiter, if you keep me healthy this coming year, then at the end of the year, I'm going to sacrifice a bull to you. Or if you keep the emperor healthy for the year, I'll sacrifice a bull to you. Then the year passes, whoever it is still healthy. You go, you sacrifice a bull, and maybe you write that down on a piece of stone or a piece of metal and set it up in the sanctuary to show that you've kept your end of the contract with the god. So we have thousands of those from the Roman world. And then I'm an archaeologist, so I, of course, am partial to the very material evidence for the ways people engaged with God. So everything from the spaces and the structures that we can excavate to the objects that people dedicate to gods, to the leftovers, the garbage from rites, things like the bones of sacrificial animals, the broken bits of pottery, of the cook pots they would use to prepare a sacrificial animal. Because, of course, in the ancient world, when I say sacrifice, you should think barbecue.
One of the things that strikes me from your answer there, almost the first question as well, to both actually, about it's kind of a transaction. You have a relationship with a deity, which is quite alien to our conception of I'm talking here from a modern kind of Western perspective of, you have an organized religion in which you are there to worship and obey the deity that you choose. Whereas this sounds much more like there's a lot of personal agency. Am I right in thinking kind of you would choose which god was your patron? You would perhaps choose when and how and why to make dedications to them. And I know I've recently been on holiday to Hadrian's Wall. That may or may not have something to do with why we're covering this in this episode. But I've seen there's lots of kind of quite small personal altars that people would have made out personally to their own particular god of choice. It's quite personal then.
Absolutely. So, right, if we think about that whole complex of lots of different gods, all of whom kind of have, a little bit of a file, a dossier, a sphere of influence, things that, they're a little bit better at than maybe another god. You would pick and choose which god you go to. It's kind of like a whole supermarket. You've got, lots of brands to choose from. And, one god might fix X a little bit better. Another god might fix Y a little bit better. But within that, of course, there's still some limits, right? If you grow up in a particular part of the empire, you're probably socialized and exposed to a set of gods that you wouldn't necessarily be exposed to somewhere else. So there's always still that that group pressure or that group expectation based on how you've been socialized to deal with gods, but absolutely to the personal agency and choice. And that's one of the things that really allows the kind of innovation and the creation of new forms of worship and religious experience that we see.
One of the things I remember is that there was a particular, I think inscription and statue to what was believed to be the god of the river there. So, do we know how much did the people that who lived in the Roman Empire think that gods controlled even the minutiae of life of nature all around them? Did they kind of believe that the pantheon of gods was controlling every, to use a phrase from Christianity, like hair that falls from your head? Are they completely omnipotent?
It depends, right? Of course, there are a whole range of ideas people have about gods. That said, gods are everywhere, and gods, for the most part, are fixed in particular places. So that, the Jupiter you worship at Rome is kind of like the Jupiter you worship in the next town over, but not quite. They've got a common characteristic, but at times you can recognize them as totally different. Or, of course you might worship a river god because that river floods repeatedly. In Rome, you've got the Tiber that runs through and up through modernity and modern channeling, right? That would flood all the time. And in order to try to stave off the ill effects of the flooding, you might make offerings to the river. It's something that is powerful, that has a potential to affect your daily life. So play it safe and offer sacrifice.
Let's then go to one of the most, I think, intriguing of the figures in this, quite diverse pantheon of gods and goddesses and things. It's not one of the members of the kind of traditional Greco-Roman set, if you see what I mean, that existed and that kind of has come down. You get it in your average book about Roman and Greek gods and things. And this is a religion that's known to us in modern times as Mithraism or Mithras worship. One of the reasons I find it so intriguing is that it was what I've seen labeled like a mystery religion. I think the first thing to start with then for our listeners would be, who was Mithras and what did the worshippers of Mithras believe about him?
So let's maybe even start more with what do we know about Mithras in the Roman world? All of a sudden, at the end of the first century CE, as Rome is kind of at its biggest extent, there appear from Germany to the eastern part of the empire to Rome itself, offerings made to this god Mithras, who hasn't really appeared prior to this point in the Roman world. Now, right away, the name Mithras is a little bit unusual. It doesn't sound like, like Jupiter or Juno or, any of these Greco-Roman deities. It's a name that is borrowed from a Persian tradition. So on the eastern edge of the empire. And we know that there is sort of like a mid-tier, mid-importance god in the Persian world called Mithra. He appears in sort of early Persian religion, things that become Zoroastrianism later on. We have hymns about him that tell us a little bit about him. But he's not like a chief deity. And then all of a sudden, as I said, in the first century CE, in the Roman world, there's all this worship of Mithras. And so there is perhaps some connection there, but it seems to be a pretty loose one. In the Roman world, this Mithras is explicitly made out to be foreign. How do we know that? Not only because his name doesn't gel with the rest of the pantheon, but also because every time he's depicted, and his image appears in every sanctuary, all of the thousands of them that are scattered across the Roman world, he appears wearing funny dress, not the toga, not the tunic that we expect people to wear. He's doing things like wearing a pointed felt cap and trousers, something no self-respecting Greek or Roman would ever be caught wearing. And these are things that automatically say, like, he's other. He belongs to that eastern side of the empire. He is a kind of barbarian who's been brought into the empire. So there's an explicit foreignizing of him that makes him a little bit more interesting, more exotic, and that claims an ancestry for a tradition of worship. Now, we'll talk, I'm sure, a little bit more about the spaces where Mithras gets worshipped, but we don't have like temples to him in Persia, in Iran, in the land where he supposedly comes from. This is a form of worship and a way of conceiving him that is totally born in the Roman Empire. It's like Persianism rather than being Persian. And the other thing to keep in mind is Persia is Rome's biggest rival through much of the period we're talking about. It's kind of like bringing on board your enemy deity and taming him, making him part of the Roman world and the Roman system.
Let's think about I don't know the best way to tackle this. Shall we talk about how widespread it became and why, or should we talk about the kind of belief structure that we know? What would make sense to come first, do you think?
Let's talk about how widespread it is, because I think that shapes what people think about Mithras and what they believe
Sure.
or not about him.
So, like you've explained there, it suddenly explodes almost out of nowhere with no firm root in the actual Persia, modern day Iran that it came from. This unique Roman style of Mithras worship explodes in popularity, and there's evidence for it, I believe, like across the empire in the first, second centuries, particularly. So, how widespread is it? Why is it so popular all of a sudden? And what sort of people are becoming Mithras worshippers?
Great question. So it is extraordinarily widespread. Every major city in the Roman Empire where there are people moving around has a handful of Mithras sanctuaries or communities devoted to worshiping Mithras. If we look at Rome, there are dozens in the city, almost certainly. Even at neighboring Ostia, the port city of Rome, in the excavated parts of the city, we've got 7 or 8 that we know about. Where I excavate in sort of a small provincial capital in modern Romania, there are at least 3, if not 4 or 5 sanctuaries to Mithras. So like it's everywhere in the empire, and it does spread extraordinarily fast in the space of maybe a generation or 2 generations. So the question is, why? Why does it spread so quickly? And I think the answer has to do with social dynamics and the fact that here is a tradition, a form of worship that that encourages individuals to actively draw people into communities. It demands a kind of proselytization, much like worship of Christ that is spreading across the Roman Empire at the time. 100 years ago, people would have looked at the belief system and said, well, what is it about the belief system that makes Mithras worship so popular, that makes it so superior to other things that aren't spreading? And I think instead we do need to look at those social components and the active creation of communities. Now, unlike Christianity, we don't have a textual record of that. We just have to infer it from the fact that things spread so quickly. The other thing that matters in shaping its spread is the fact that we tend to see Mithras worship communities as being medium-sized, small, maybe 30 people in a community, mostly men, almost exclusively men for those who get initiated, which is something we can come back to. And they all seem to know each other already, to be parts of small social networks, whether it is at working for the same like mining industry in the mining provinces, whether it's being part of the same military unit. In places like Britain, it's really closely tied to military groups, or working for the imperial customs system. So you have those pre-existing dynamics that tie people together, and then it spreads through friend groups.
So is it, in a way, that kind of juxtaposes what we were saying before about religion, again, the word, but religion being almost this personal transactional thing of, well, I want this to happen for me, so I'm going to go to this particular god. That's not what Mithras worship seems to be about. It's much more community focused, or a group of people coming together and trying to get people to join. Is that, am I right in kind of reading it that way?
Absolutely. And as far as we can see, they have what amount to member lists in some communities. They get together regularly. They do all of these things that make them feel like a small community. And that is, I think, again, one of the reasons for the success or the rapid spread and the uptake of Mithras worship across the empire. In addition to the fact that you have experts who, by generating these communities, by drawing people in, end up probably making a good deal of their livelihood off of these communities.
Well, that always helps, doesn't it? And that's something that's persistent through the ages, let's say, using religious belief and seeing where you can get a profit from it as well. Well, what about, you mentioned, you touched briefly there on it tended to be men more, particularly who get initiated. One of the things that's, I do not claim to be an expert in this at all, but one of the things that I've seen written in my cursory reading about early Christianity is that it actually, women, it kind of appealed to them, and they were almost on an equal standing in early Christianity. So what was the kind of gender dynamics going on here? Was it kind of, I know it's been associated in Britain with military kind of being a kind of military religion almost. So what was going on with that aspect?
Yeah, so this is one of the unusual features of Mithras worship. And it's one that's a little bit debated. So of the, almost roughly 2,000 names of worshipers that we have of Mithras across the empire, they're all men. There's not a single woman attested. Literary evidence, mostly written centuries later by hostile Christian authors, debates whether or not women are involved, right? One author will say, yes, women are involved. They're called hyenas because they're wild in this cult, which is why it's so bad if you're a Christian. But others say, no, it is male only. And that does seem to be more of the case. So yes, this is something that sets it apart. Why it should be male only is less clear. And you brought up the example of, soldiers in Britain. One thing that we've learned archaeologically in the past couple of decades through work and the archaeology of Roman forts is that these aren't like, all male barracks the way, we used to think. Many soldiers have families, children living with them. They may not be legally married, because if you're a soldier up until the 3rd century, you can't legally marry. You have to be single, but they have partners, they have children, with them in the barracks. So it's not like this, exclusive male club. But I think that, as in other periods and with other kinds of groups, having boundaries of exclusivity, saying we are only open to men in this case, it gives it a little bit more of a potential allure, because it makes you feel like you're part of an exclusive group, when you can draw a boundary and say, no, women are not part of this.
And that kind of exclusive and community sense to it is, like I said before, kind of setting it apart from the free-for-all of Roman religion.
Absolutely.
And making it seem like something, a club you want to be a part of.
Absolutely.
Well, let's then talk about Mithras himself and what his worshippers believed about him, and what the whole kind of, again, to use the term religion, but Mithraism was about. So, well, take us through it, Matthew. Who was he according to his worshippers?
Well, according to his worshippers, he, in many dedications, is spelled out to be Deus invictus Mithras, the god. So he's divine, Deus. He is invictus. He's undefeated. He's unconquerable. He's unbeatable. So he has that kind of successful track record. In this marketplace, if you're looking for a god who can get things done, there's a piece of branding for you. You go to the unconquerable god because he'll do what needs to be done. And his name Mithras, of course, as I said, adds that foreignness. Now he has a backstory. He has a myth that goes with him that is sort of, again, loosely adapted from what we know of the Persian Mithra. When he is depicted, he's often depicted stabbing a bull. He sort of grabs the bull by the snout, pulls up that snout, takes his little knife and jams it into the bull's shoulder. So he's, again, a kind of violent god. But it seems that violence also has a purpose, because in some cases, his tail is shown turning into like a sheath of wheat. He's often set into a cosmic sphere, so shown within a zodiac, right? The signs of astrology, and the movement of the heavens around him, or with depictions of the sun and the moon. So he has that kind of broad range over the entire cosmos. And those are some of the elements of his persona that we can pick up looking at the images, looking at the dedications people make to him. But as with any character, literary character, divine character, people have different versions. And that's one of the things that emerges as we look at communities across the empire. He's always Persian, he's always Eastern, but they tell the story about him in slightly different ways. They show scenes of him doing different things, and we don't have like the textual account. We don't have the written story. We have to kind of piece it together from these images. Show him doing things like not only stabbing the bull, but throwing the bull, slinging the bull over his shoulder, carrying it around, dining with the sun god Sol on the skin that has been removed from this bull. Sometimes, sending the sun god off to, ride across the horizon with the sun. But that level of myth and the deep astrological connotations seem to be a little bit more variable depending on where you are, who your community leader is, things like that.
So, as you've kind of mentioned, we don't have a text for this. So that, in a way, is one of the differences. Like I said, with the modern religions, is not, we don't have a single set document of where everyone's got to agree to this, and that leads, I guess, to that differences of interpretation.
Absolutely. And again, right, like people can agree on a few things. He is a god, he is unconquerable, and his name is Mithras. And he stabs a bull. But beyond that, you might weave slightly different stories around that kind of core scaffolding that's shared.
What I think you've touched on it a little bit, but what evidence do we have for this? Because I think one of the problems with studying Mithras worship, I believe, is that so much of it comes from later Christian authors who necessarily, obviously, are out to criticize the pagans, for their strange rituals and beliefs.
Absolutely. So let me give you one example of this variability just from some of my own excavation and research. So in the Danubian region, there seems to be a practice of worshiping the transit of the god. We're not quite sure what that is. Maybe it's astrological. In one case, it's paired with an image of Mithras with that bull slung over his shoulder. But that seems to be something that is confined to a few sites that are that involve worshippers who work in the imperial customs system of the empire. So they have like their own little practice, their own version of worshiping and dedicating to the transit of the god. That isn't shared by, say, a worshipper of Mithras in Rome or in Spain or in Britain. And similarly, at a site like Ostia, just outside of Rome, we have a number of sanctuaries to Mithras that are decorated with really deep astrological imagery that ties into a strain of cosmological beliefs related to Roman interpretations of Plato. But they only really appear with that level of detail and thought throughness at Ostia. And it seems like there's like a really involved astrological community, so much so that one of the sanctuaries to Mithras might even be related to the philosopher, writer, Neoplatonist Apuleius. And so there we see like the personal adaptation of this central scaffolding around Mithras, but woven in its own direction.
And so because of that flexibility and that adaptability of Mithras worship, I guess it makes it very difficult for us today to say with any confidence what different Mithras worshippers believed about him, about what he could offer them. Because like we've been saying, often, the choice of which god to worship or dedicate to was based on some sort of transaction of what they were good at, so to speak. Do we have any idea, and again, it might be different for each community, what did Mithras offer to people in an age in which it was much more transactional?
One of the things that Mithras worship offered was exclusivity, was status, especially to those who might not have other venues for getting social power or claiming social authority. People like slaves or former slaves, people involved, as I said, in things like the imperial customs system, or even mid-level soldiers. This is a way of giving themselves greater prestige, feeling like they are part of something exclusive. And that is really where Mithras worship shines. And that is something that has less to do with, with codified beliefs than it does, again, with the kinds of practices that people engage in to make that exclusivity felt and to make that sense of belonging to an exclusive community felt and experienced and lived and reinforced.
That's really interesting. It almost, again, this is like projecting modern things onto the past, but it kind of feels like a kind of aspirational kind of, middle class. It almost reminds me a little bit of like Freemasonry, kind of joining a
Absolutely.
club to be part of something, to be part of a network. Were there connections between the communities? Were they linked up in any way? Did it provide that advantage?
Absolutely. So we do, in some ways, each community is mostly independent. There's not like, like a pope at Rome or some kind of real hierarchy overseeing things, as far as we can tell. But there are certainly connections. We have evidence of Mithras worshippers who move between sanctuaries, or sometimes they move and they start a new Mithras worship community wherever it is they move to. So there are those kinds of connections. We also have evidence at this site called Verunum, where we have the membership roster of the community. We can reconstruct a little bit of like the micro history of that group. And when one of the community leaders, they're called fathers, when one of the fathers of the community, they have two, dies suddenly, instead of promoting a member of their community, they seem to have to look outside the community to find a new expert. And they import a new father. But later on, members of that community itself, when they need a new father, because one of them leaves or dies, gets promoted from within. So it does seem like, there are connections between these groups. And we also have some archaeological evidence for those connections in terms of the kinds of special effects that create distinctive experiences for worshippers in these sanctuaries. So up in Belgium, a few years ago, one of my colleagues excavated this pot that has a snake wrapped around the rim. The snake is one of the animals that often appears alongside Mithraism images. And she found that this snake on the outside of the pot was hollow, so that if you heated up a liquid in the pot itself, the snake would like spit steam and a little bit of hot water, and it would look like the snake was like coming to life on the pot. Now, more recently, on the opposite side of the Roman Empire, in the middle of rural Syria, a team at Hawarta excavated a snake pot that does exactly the same thing, that has this tube so the snake can spit. It's a special effect that's not used, as far as we know, in any other form of cult, but yet we have, things that are made locally. They're not moving themselves. They're all produced in these towns, presumably by experts who have a common bag of effects that they know. So there's evidence for some of those linkages, and perhaps even for the training of experts in these kinds of effects.
One of the things that intrigues me is and it lends itself to what you've kind of been saying there, is there's so many kind of and I don't know with what degree of confidence we can actually talk about them as certainties, but theories about what it was that Mithras as a deity in the kind of canon, if so to speak, had actually done, and what he had power over. We've mentioned the kind of cosmic relationship with the sun and the moon. He also the symbolism of the killing of the bull, what particularly that means. I've seen it written that it's relating to fertilizing the earth and creating life. Also, rather comically, Mithras being born from a rock, which is an interesting concept. Is it just a kind of, again, a free-for-all of, each community picks a particular stories and legends of what Mithras had achieved in his unconquerable career? Or is there anything we can kind of certainly say that Mithras worshippers thought he had done?
So again, right, we're back to this question of the myth and the stories that are told in each community. And, there does seem to be a sort of restricted range of stories, but communities might emphasize these stories differently. So yes, Mithras seems to be born from a rock. He's called the rock-born Mithras in some inscriptions, and we have both on the big reliefs that show Mithras stabbing the bull. Sometimes they're little side scenes that show him born of stone. And in places like Britain, we even have freestanding statues that stood in the sanctuaries that would show him rising out of a rubbly rock pile, or hatching from like a rock egg in one case. Um, so there are some common stories, but again, communities might choose to emphasize them differently. And beyond the, what happened, the narrative itself, people can freight different meanings, different interpretations on those same things. And that's something, anyone who looks at folklore or storytelling, or narrative, can talk about. Um, right? Even if you've got the same events, you can look at it through very different lenses.
Absolutely, yeah. I want to focus in a bit on the experience of Mithras worship for the faithful. This was something that um, is very intriguing, and again, it may not have been centralized. It may be different for each one. But I was a few weeks ago at a temple of Mithras on Hadrian's Wall, and of course, it had a plaque with a diagram of what it looked like. So I'm going to kind of set out my very basic knowledge, and I want kind of to see how it stands up and what you kind of make of it, Matthew. So this temple, or Mithraeum, is that right? Mithraeum.
Yep.
Had a kind of it's described as being built like a cave, so that it would be dark inside. It had a kind of outer, I don't know what you call it, an antechamber, where people would go through particular ordeals or initiations in order to be allowed into the inner chamber, which had a kind of altar and the relief of the famous scene of the bull. And actually, relating to your snake example, the altar kind of was designed in such a way that presumably candles could be put into it so that it would illuminate certain scenes and look like the sun was shining or whatever, which was quite nice. But that there was different levels of initiation. Certain people sat in different places closer to the father at the front. Now, is that just a kind of tourist notice board trying to make everything sound lovely and clear and like we know exactly what was going on? Or can we actually talk about the experience of Mithras worship in such a way?
There is a lot of accuracy in that description, and there's some imaginative flourishes, to make sense of what we have. So maybe we should start with what we have, the physical things, and the spaces themselves. So temples to Mithras were laid out in a very similar way across the empire. You would enter a small antechamber, and usually this would be set down some steps below ground level. And um, worshippers, when they write about temples to Mithras in their inscriptions, sometimes describe them as caves. The term Mithraeum that we use doesn't appear. No ancient person would ever call a sanctuary to Mithras a Mithraeum. They would probably call it a cave or a temple to Mithras. So you go down some steps into that foreroom. Probably not used for initiation. These spaces tend to be pretty small, and archaeologically, what we often have in them are just cupboards. It's like the storeroom. But what it does is allows you to, when you go in the front entrance, then take usually a dog-leg turn, so that from the front door, you can't see the main room of the sanctuary. You've got to go in a little bit and then turn to see in the main room. And the main rooms are laid out very similarly. There's a central nave that allows you to walk from one end, the entrance to the room, to the other. And at the far end is where you have your picture of Mithras, sometimes lit up for dramatic effect with oil lamps, or possibly candles. And sometimes those images of Mithras, they do things like incorporate like gold gilding on his face so it shines and sparkles, or they put little pieces of cut glass around the edges that also get a little bit of sparkle to them, that again create a really distinct and powerful experience. On either side of that nave, there are two benches that stretch pretty much the whole length of the room. Probably not windows, so it is dark, and we find lots of lamps in these spaces, so they are artificially lit. The ceilings sometimes also had things like a blue, dark blue nighttime sky with stars, and sometimes bits of rock crystal or other things put in that made them shimmer a little bit, right? So you get a sense that this really is all about the effect on the visitor, creating a really special space. And it becomes even more weird and unusual when we think about most of the ways people would encounter gods in the Roman world. Instead of going down to a temple, you'd go up temple steps. Um, Most temples in the Roman world were raised on tall podia, lifting the gods to the sky. So already you get like that totally opposite, again, foreign feeling, different feeling going in. And most things like sacrifice and engagement with the gods would happen outdoors in the Roman world, in the courtyards in front of temple spaces. The temple is basically where you stick the statue of the god and the god lives. In Mithraea, you're doing a lot of those activities indoors. So again, very, very different feeling. And so, yeah, there are these things that set the practice and the space apart from the everyday and make it seem very different, very special, very unusual.
It's quite a kind of striking image, and I think it's a great point to contrast it with the very public worship of many pagan gods, well, overall, but also particularly in Rome. And this seems a very intimate, very private setting. And it kind of feeds into that exclusivity as well. Unless you're a member, you can't see what goes on. You can't, understand anything, which is, I think, why it's called labeled a kind of mystery religion, is that it's not public. It's only for the initiated.
Yeah, so absolutely on it being a little bit more private and creating that sense of exclusivity. And indeed, what people are doing in there tends to be having meals, having fancy meals with special foods as they recline on those benches, which is what you do at important dinner parties in the Roman world. But I do want to talk a little bit about calling it a mystery cult too.
Sure, yeah.
This is something that ancient authors say, right? There are the mysteria of Mithras, the Greek word mysteria. And mystery, mysteria, in Greek and in the ancient world doesn't really mean the same as mystery, big question mark today. What a mysteria is something that changes your status somehow. It involves initiation and it involves the transformation that initiation brings about. So when we say mysteria, we're not talking about, people don't know it. We're talking about it's something that makes you different and that sets you apart. And that seems to be the core of this cult. Now, the reason it's kind of a modern mystery to us, scratch our head, wonder about it, is because we don't have the writings, or we have these tantalizing and distorted views from Christian authors that make it sound super weird and wild, and like devil worship, as some Christian authors will call it.
So, can we then say anything about the kind of initiation, the rituals, what happened when you were elevated, or is it kind of is it a mystery to us to use that word again?
We can say a great deal about the initiations um, based on the sources we have, and especially some of the archaeology. So we know that there are ranks or grades that individuals can pass through as part of their membership in this community. It's not clear if everyone who's like a member who goes in to be part of the group and dines undergoes all of those initiations, or if there's just sort of like a basic member and then advanced standing member sort of division. It seems that there are 7 of these. There's one Christian author, Saint Jerome, who writes about them and names them and describes them, and his description corresponds to a mosaic floor that seems to have images related to each of these 7 from just outside of Rome. But more broadly, in the rest of the empire, it's only a few of these grades or ranks that seem to get picked up and really celebrated. Kind of the mid-level lion or the high-level father. And there seems to also be some wiggle room. So, on the eastern edge of the empire, at Dura Europos, famously called Pompeii of the Syrian desert, we have a really well-preserved sanctuary to Mithras, and people have scratched their ranks on the wall, and they're ones that we don't hear about anywhere else. We don't hear about them in Rome. We don't hear about them in Ostia. We don't hear about them in Jerome. Things like strengthener, or instead of a lion, you get like the meloleon, the wannabe lion, as well. So there seems to be also some diversity there with the grades, but the idea is you go through these steps, or have the ability, the potential to go through these steps. Now, what's actually involved? You want to know, the juicy details of initiation. Are these rites of terror? Are they, traumatic things? Almost certainly. And we can say that there's also probably some consistency. Now, we have Christian accounts that, that describe them as, in some cases, involving particular things like fire or honey. We have one Christian author who's probably not all that accurate, talking about like privations and denials of things for days, and if you survive, then you advance. So sort of like an ascetic ideal of self-denial, but again, we have some evidence archaeologically too. We have at one site a trick sword that seems to have been used in initiation rites. It's like a regular sword, but it has a bend in the middle, so you can put it around you and make it look like someone's been run through with a sword, without actually stabbing them. And it seems like that was probably involved in some of these initiations to create that sense of terror, when you think someone's been stabbed, but actually they're okay. Theater, spectacle. And then we have images, we have paintings that seem to show steps of initiation in very similar ways, both in Capua, which is in central Italy, and in Caesarea, which is in Israel. So different sides of the empire, and they seem to show similar steps. And these two look to be kind of terrifying, where we see the person being initiated, stripped naked, not wearing any clothes, hands bound behind his back, kneeling, blindfolded, maybe having something like a torch passed next to his body. So these are the things that that would have an impact, and that would be really felt, and again, that contribute to that sense of not only exclusivity. I've been through something so unique, so traumatic, that it has set me apart, made me one of these initiates, but also that creates a sense of belonging to the group of people who've gone through that, kind of like hazing, in a way.
And it's a pretty, common thread through so many religions, but also kind of groups and societies of various kinds, that you need to kind of go through some ordeal in order to reach this higher plane, or to attain membership. Is that what's going on here? Is it about, you have to prove yourself worthy? Is it about you have to go through something painful or difficult in order to prove yourself, or in order to mentally reach a higher plane, kind of thing?
I'm not even sure we have to go that far. Maybe it is a little bit about proving yourself, but I think it is more the kind of that group dynamic and solidifying being part of a group. So there's some parallels looking at initiation rites in Africa and in the Pacific, um, and they look at how not only does having that traumatic experience um, make you feel like part of that exclusive set, but the way that after you've done it, you often participate in hazing the next generation or the next round, and that too makes you feel even more part of the group. So it might be partially personal, like proving yourself, um, but I think the impact is also in um, helping to draw and make firm that line between insider and outsider.
Yeah, it's once again with this, I think we'll keep coming back to it. It's about being part of something, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's about being part of a community. And I suppose, if it's, as we've kind of painted the picture of the sanctuary, it's somewhere quite intimate. It's somewhere that people come together socially, religiously, and it's about, I suppose, being part of that club and having a shared experience to base everything else off.
Yeah. And that, again, right, these, for the most part, all of the sanctuaries to Mithras are roughly the same size. You can fit 20, 30 people inside. And I mentioned earlier the membership list at Varunam. It even seems like as that community got too big, they decided to form like a second Mithras sanctuary because it was no longer having that small group dynamic, and that really does seem to be the key to this whole thing.
And that's really interesting as well, because you said it's like what set it apart was something that you actually went out to try and recruit people and build a community, but that they didn't want that to be too big a community. It has to be basically small enough that it could be a group of, a social group of friends. Once it gets
Yeah,
bigger than that, we need a new community.
yeah,
That's really interesting. Now, of course, we don't have across the Near East, North Africa, and Europe lots of Mithras worshippers today. Um, so something happened to Mithras worship. Um, I mean, again, for someone who's not an expert, I'm probably thinking maybe Christianity, but what do we know about the demise of Mithras worship? When, why, and how?
that's a great question. And this is a picture that is changing so quickly now as people are starting to ask that very question. Um, 50 years ago, even 20 years ago, people would have said Christianity meant the end of Mithras worship. We have a new exclusive religion. We have some evidence for violent destruction in a couple of Mithras sanctuaries, and we have a textual account of how basically the administrator of the city of Rome went and smashed up a Mithraeum in the 4th century. So, Christianity maybe plays a role in this, but it's certainly not an exclusive role because more and more we are seeing how Mithras worship continued into the 4th century and even into the 5th century. So, periods when Christ worship had become the state religion of the Roman world, and so-called pagan practices and temples were closed and banned. Um, so it's not just Christianity that spells the end. I have a colleague, David Walsh, who has recently argued that there were some changes in how people worship Mithras in this period, in the 4th, 5th centuries, that created less of a group bond. and that because there was less of a group bond, people simply weren't as socially, emotionally, and financially invested in the cult, which made it easy to kind of just dry up. I think there are other explanations one might look at as well. These communities are very closely tied to their leaders, to their charismatic patres, to those fathers who are in charge. And it seems like anytime there's like a transition in the father, that changes the dynamics of the community. Um, these are communities based on charismatic individuals leading them. And so if we look in general, not just in the, 4th, 5th century, we find that most Mithras worship communities seem to last 2 generations, maybe 3 generations. And that's when they dry up. So it's more just kind of the natural life cycle of groups based around charismatic leaders, um, as much as it is Christianity or anything else. And with the growth of Christianity, um, that's where many of the charismatic, potentially charismatic leaders end up going to make their living and get involved, as opposed to learning how to worship Mithras and building new Mithras worship communities. So I think that probably has a lot to do with it as well. And then last factor one might consider, because it's never one thing, right? In history, we all know it's the constellation of things that affect change. The other thing we might look at is the fact that in the 3rd and 4th century, society in the wider Roman world is changing rapidly, and Mithras worship, as it is structured in the 2nd and 3rd century CE, is so closely tied to the kinds of hierarchies and status systems that matter in that period. And it may just be that the social structures within Mithras worship don't keep abreast, don't keep up with the bigger social changes that are happening around it. And so it becomes kind of obsolete. It no longer fits in the social world that's happening in the 4th and 5th centuries.
One of the things that is a kind of very broad brushstrokes here trend of the Roman Empire is that the later empire in the 4th, 5th centuries, there's a decline in the kind of the wealthier people. Their way of showing civic pride would be building something in the town or whatever in the early stages, but that seems to dry up in the later stages of the empire, and people obviously find different ways of expressing their wealth and expressing their community feel, perhaps through Christianity. Do you think that has anything to do with it? If Mithras worship is so much about some group of local people coming together, building a Mithraism, putting together a community, getting in an expert, this sort of thing. If the trend in Roman society is no longer to do some big public show of affection, show of wealth to your community, does that perhaps play into it? I don't know.
It plays in maybe a little bit, but one of the things to remember about Mithras worship is it's rarely like the leaders of towns who are paying for these new sanctuaries. It's often kind of the sort of middle class of a town who's engaged in this cult. So, yeah, of course, somebody's got to pay to build the temple. But when it comes to things like having those semi-regular meals that people dine together, that seems to be much more like crowdfunded or even there's some ceramic evidence like potluck style. So it doesn't need the same like civic social background to say throwing up a really elaborate new temple to Jupiter or someone like that, a god like that in the city center. Mithras worship always tends to happen on like private land, and at a smaller scale than that. So I think more than that social shift away from the civic world, um, it much more has to do um, with the wider um, ways that people seek or attain their social goals. Um, it's the fourth and fifth centuries become much less about competitive individual distinction, the kind of setting yourself off exclusively, um, than earlier centuries, or people draw those boundaries of being in and out in slightly different ways. And I think that is potentially to the detriment of Mithras worship.
And I suppose those social forces are so important because this is such a social religion, so much based on people coming together and feeling that
Absolutely.
community spirit and feeling that togetherness. And I think it was a fascinating point you made about kind of them they just last 2 or 3 generations. It's a group of almost, a group of friends in a town and their children perhaps, and maybe their grandchildren. But then after that, the ties kind of fade with time.
Yeah, exactly. Or, if you've got a military unit that then moves somewhere else, or that, that fractures or that shifts over time as recruitment patterns change, that too has an impact. So it's all of those little changes that sort of accrue over time, that that, as you say, like, just lead to the drying up of individual communities.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we did a series a while back on the 5th century in Britain, which is obviously that's a mystery, to use that word
Yeah,
again, real mystery. And one of the things, actually, one of the people we talked to was, sometimes things might just happen for reasons that we don't know now. They might not have liked a particular person or a particular place and decide, no, let's move or let's change that, which, are just unknowable to us now, and not because of any particular huge cataclysmic event that's caused a particular town to shift 3 miles down the river.
yeah, absolutely.
So to kind of conclude, what do you think Mithras worship, tells us about the Roman world, the Roman mind? Um, and do you think, you kind of alluded to it a little bit there, do you think there is much more to learn, or do you think we know what we know, as little as it is?
Let me start, because the last question is the easiest to answer. There is so much more we can learn about Mithras worship, and archaeology is fundamentally transforming our understandings of the cult, so that we're not reliant on these hostile Christian distortions of what's going on, or the views of a philosopher who is similarly distorting it for his own ends and to make his own points. So I think in 10 years, someone will come on your podcast and give you a very different version of Mithras worship than I'm giving today. And that will be fantastic. And that means we're all doing our jobs. So a lot more to learn. But what does it tell us about the wider Roman Empire? What are the big takeaways from this? Well, first, I think it does point to the ways in which the Roman Empire was really such a place for religious innovation. And it helps us to recontextualize things like early Christianity. It does offer us a comparative foil for seeing how different dynamics of group might operate. Um, it helps us to see the ways in which, in a multicultural, really kind of global world, um, small groups, not having a sense of alienation from groups, um, matter, and being able to bring people together in different ways, and to reconfigure those social networks, really matters. Um, and I think that Mithras worship is also a great case study for how we think about religion in the ancient world and how we've thought about it, a sort of historiography in moving away from things like belief to looking at some of these social dynamics as potentially more important and more central to worship and to things that we might loosely call religion.
Absolutely. I think that's something I've really taken away from this, is that it, almost the belief, the story, the mythology of Mithras is not so important. It appears in the worship as the actual kind of practice, the social dynamic, the everyday almost, rather than the kind of big cosmic questions that come up from this kind of cult. Well, all that remains is to say thank you so much, Matthew, for giving us so much of your time and enlightening us on the mystery of Mithras.
Thank you again for having me, and I do encourage all of your listeners to go and visit these sites. You said visiting a Mithraeum was really impactful for you. They're fantastic sites. Go visit your archaeological sites. Go support them, and go try to imagine the experiences of worship in the ancient world.
Absolutely. Peter.
Well, thank you, Matthew. It'll be, like you said earlier, it'll be very interesting to see how the story of Mithraism or Mithras worship evolves over the next 10, 20 years or so. I look forward to seeing how that story changes with the advancement of technology and archaeology and everything as time goes on. So thank you, Matthew, for coming on the show and telling us such a very enlightening and interesting and fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
I've been Peter.
And I've been Alex. And thanks for listening to History's Most.